Hello everyone. I'm here to teach English literature for NET, UGC NET JRF, and today we'll be starting with the Old English period. That is supposed to be your first chapter in the history of English literature. But before we dive right into the Old English period, the Anglo-Saxon Norman period, we will first briefly discuss what it means to read the history of literature, especially English literature. So we all know, it's common sense that everything that has been composed in written form is literature. Ballads, folk songs, poems, all these things that were composed or have passed down from generation to generation, even in the old times when there was no writing, or when there was not a lot of written records, has been preserved, has been written by someone. And whatever that is written, everything that is written, doesn't matter if it's technical or quite personal, conceptual, or in any form, it is still considered literature. But largely, when we talk about literature, it is the dramatization effect, the dramatization of human emotions, thoughts, feelings, observations. Literature is the essence of life. What makes it so important is that literature helps us stand face to face with that has been. We wouldn't know about how people in the yesteryears thought, or how they lived, or how the culture was, or what kind of society they lived in, if it wasn't for literature. It is a kind of history, a dramatized history, yes, or it could also be said a historicized literature, historicized literature, yes, sure, when you ascribe historical qualities to a piece of writing, anything that gives us information about history of a period, it could be referred to as history. So literature is history to a greater degree. In modern times, it has almost substituted religion, because in the old English times, or even in the medieval times, Bible was considered to be the supreme literature, because it was dictated by the Son of God, and it is a document that teaches you how to live, or what to do, or how to carry out your daily life. But now in the modern times, by and by, Bible was not considered to be that important because of a crisis of faith, as we will read when we read about the Victorian era and the later modern times. So a few of the features of the modern era, modern English period, were that there was a crisis of faith. Religion started to break down, a lot of denominations came up, and people stopped believing in the ultimate power of Bible to redeem them. So they started writing a lot more about rebelling, to break the established code, to come up with new forms of poetry. So in the modern times, English literature has taken somewhat of a precedence over religion. Through literature, we can explore the whole spectrum of human emotions. Of course, every emotion that you can possibly imagine that a person could feel has been written about. Like James Baldwin said, that when you read literature, you realize that your griefs, your sufferings, your sorrows are not only personal, but they are universal. They happen in one form or another to everybody, and they have been happening through centuries. So you're not alone. So this cycle of life goes on. So in that sense, literature is a great companion. Books are your best friend. That is true. Now, as we will go through different periods of English literature, where different kinds of works have come up. As we read the history of English literature, we are also reading the history of the English people, because both of them are very closely intertwined. As language and literature developed and it took a specific form, it evolved, it is closely related, and it developed hand in hand with the culture and subsequently the cultural and subsequently the national identity of people. First the English and then the British, because Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales, they were all added later. So that is why it is so important to read the history of English literature, not only to read about the literature but also to understand the general culture and what kind of people there were who were writing, or who were in power, because most of the writers were courtiers at that time, so they had to patronize the king or the queen. So now language English, we will read about its history, how it started, how it took form, how it evolved from the old English to the kind of English that we read today. This transmission of language from England to then colonies to the rest of the world, from British English literature to the Commonwealth English literature in different parts of the world, which was also a part of the history of English literature that we will read in the later classes. So now today we will start with the Old English period. Please start making notes. We all should always remember that verse was always composed before the prose, because verse is poetry. It is easy, it is rhythmic, it has a tune, it has a sing-songy quality. So it is easy for people to recite in the form of verse a story or an idea rather than prose. So verse was always composed before the prose. Now, whatever extant remains we have of the Old English literature, they have been composed almost 300 years later, after the original poems were spoken. So suppose I am the Old English person and I have said something, I've orally passed something down to the generations, and almost 300 years later of my speaking the poem, it was written down by someone, and now we have those copies. So about the Old English poets, we only know their names, we don't know their history or the kind of families they were from. So what we know is their signature, through what have they've undersigned the poems in the manuscripts. So the Old English period largely can be said to be between 400 AD and 1150 AD. So this is largely the extent of the Old English period, and it covers three different ethnicities. First the Angles, then the Saxons, then the Normans, who were basically from Normandy, France. So the Norman conquest, which is a very important landmark in the history of English literature and the development of English language, happened in 1066 AD. It is very important. A lot of questions have been asked through the years on this Norman conquest, because that is where the influence of the French court and the French language began on English, on the development of English language, on the language of the Angles and the Saxons. So now, before there were the Angles and the Saxons and all these tribes that came and occupied England, there were Romans in England. And the fall of Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, we know. So in around 400 AD, They left England, the Romans left England, and because of the lack of authority and protection, England was vulnerable from the north. So a lot of invaders would come from the north, from the Scandinavian countries. So the first English people after the Romans departed, they came from the continent as mercenaries. So they came from Europe, they traveled from Europe to England as mercenaries, as soldiers, basically, as the remains of the Roman Empire. And they basically wanted to fight the Picts and the Scots, and then they began to settle. And these continental people, these people from the Europe, these tribes, these ethnicities were called the Angles and the Saxons. They were the first English people. They were the precursors of the English identity. They were these ancestors, English ancestors. So now they were pagan English people, there was no Christianization. The Christianization of these pagan tribes, these pagan English tribes, was carried out by the Irish missionaries. And this Christianization began in Northumbria. There's a region called Northumbria on the English island, and there itself the church was established, and people were inducted into the religion, and monasteries were established. But however, Roman influence was still retained in the southern part of England, which was called Kent. So there was still the Roman influence there. Now, this took place after 400 AD to 800 AD. Now, 800 AD, people from the north, the Danes, they come and they invade England. Now, the Danes have come and invaded England and defeated the local tribes. Now, so they've started settling down. Because they have started settling down, now this gives rise to this region, this western region in England called Wessex. And the greatest kings of the Wessex was King Alfred the Great. And another important name, another important information, please remember. So now, since King Alfred was the king of Wessex, and Wessex was very powerful back then, so now the Dane law in England has established, and permanent settlement of Danes has occurred. And the Danish king has taken the throne of England in 1017 AD. This actually changed the Old English in many ways, because all these gods that the Danes had, the Scandinavians had, Thor, Freya, Odin, in their Norse mythology, the weekdays were named after those gods, like Thor, Thursday, Freya, Friday. So from there, the names of the weekdays have come. So a lot of influence of the Nordic languages was there in this period when there were Danes and there was a Danish king. So the Danes have been there. Now the French have come with the Norman conquest, which is 1066 AD. Now begins the French influence.